This is the second in a series on Ralph Miliband's Marxism and Politics. This video covers Chapter 5, Class and Party. You'll notice I've skipped a lot, about 90 pages if you add up the introduction and the two chapters called The Defense of the Old Order. The first of those was Chapter 3, about the centuries-long war of ideas between Marxists and pro-capitalism Democrats, small d. And the second one was Chapter 4, which discusses the Marxist view of the state. I skipped those chapters so that we can stick to the theme of revolutionary action and change, which returns to center stage in Chapter 5 and remains the focus for the rest of the book. Let's dive back in with another really basic question. What is organization? It's easy to see that the working class needs to get organized in some way because the landlords, the factory owners, and big private property in general are damn sure going to be organized in maintaining their interests as rent-seeking owners. How the working class should get organized is a more contentious question. There are those who emphasize the role of an intellectual vanguard, a corps of activists, organizers, and leaders whose class consciousness is the most advanced, as Wikipedia says. And there are those who emphasize the role of spontaneous collective action. If you're doing a black and white thinking, there's no way to square the two tendencies. Either the masses need a vanguard to lead it to victory, or victory can only come at the hands of the working class through its own actions directly. But, Miliband says, there is no Marxist thinker who has ever advocated spontaneity with no organization, or organization with no popular support. You need both. Now we get into what Marx had to say. These are very cluttered slides, I know. I wanted to show the original sources for the Marx quotes. The portions of the Marx quotes that I'd like to focus on are set off in red. Citations are provided for those inclined to dig deeper, but for most people that don't even try to read all the text on these next few slides, Miliband says Marx stands at one end of the spontaneity versus organization spectrum. For Marx's thoughts about organizing, we can look at pamphlets and other internal documents of the First International, also known as the International Working Men's Association. The First International, which comes up again in the text, was, as the name suggests, an international association of working people. By the way, women were allowed to join. This was agreed to about 7 months after it was founded. The First International brought together, however temporarily, socialists of all types, including communists, anarchists, stateless socialists, and class struggle trade unionists. By 1872, though, the anarchists and Marxists were meeting separately. The unity didn't last. In the administrative rules for the First International, Marx wrote that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. He wasn't particularly concerned with the form which the political organization should assume. He left the question of how to organize to the workers of individual countries. Rather than conceiving the First International as a centralized form of government for labor, he saw it as a network of affiliated societies pledged to shared goals. Trade unions must become organizing centers, aiding social movements and political movements that tend in the direction of emancipation for the working class. Miliband drops a quote here. Trade unions are the schools of socialism. It's a great quote. There's been some discussion since the 1860s about whether Marx actually said it. Kautsky, we'll see him again later, attributes the quote to an interview with Marx. Others attribute the quote to a speech. I'm not a professional Marxologist. I'm just telling you what I found, trying to find the source for this quote. Anyway, Miliband discusses the exaltation of the party among leftists after Engels' death. He writes, with the growth of working-class parties after Engels' death in 1895, also went a very general, though of course not unanimous, acceptance that the transformation of capitalist society must be envisaged as a strictly constitutional process, which must on no account be endangered by an ill-conceived activism and adventurist politics. This perspective inevitably led to the exaltation of the party as the guardian of the working class against those who pressed actions and policies which the leadership of the party judged and proclaimed to be irresponsible and dangerous. Lenin conceived from his earliest days of a party of professional revolutionaries adapted to the struggle against a despotic regime by a highly centralized command structure which came to be called democratic centralism. He did not suggest, before 1914, that such a centralized command structure was necessary in countries where political liberty exists. The essence of Lenin's contribution to Marxism, Miliband says, was that there must be organization and direction if the revolutionary process was to be advanced. Lenin did not fear the passivity of the working class, but that its struggles would lack political effectiveness and revolutionary purpose. It was to this end that the party was essential. A different approach was taken by the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD. The SPD sought to build a strong, unified party by building a coalition between the working class and other classes. Anyone who wanted a radical reorganization of the social order was welcome to join the Party of the Working Class. The coalition building was successful. Not everyone in the party was happy about it. The SPD was alienating a substantial portion of its left-wing members. But the coalition held well into World War I. After all, when you're a leftist, the pressure not to split is very strong. Every split weakens the movement, at least in the short term. Those who split must fear isolation, ineffectiveness, and irrelevance. And leftists who have been around the movement a while know socialist movements have a long and sometimes depressing history of splintering. This slide shows splits among workers' parties in the UK. But there are similar diagrams for socialist groups in the US with like 10 times as many splits, and the US hasn't even had a left for most of the past 70 years. Miliband thinks that multiple tendencies and multiple parties is the natural state of the socialist left. And, he says, there's nothing in classical Marxism that says otherwise. The idea that there can only be one party that can lay claim to being the single legitimate expression of the labor movement was a later invention. Returning to the SPD, before and after World War I, we see that the SPD went from being a minority party to the ruling party, as these electoral maps of the 1912 and 1919 federal elections show. But we know what comes next in German history. As the Nazis built power in the run-up to the 1932 election, the SPD rebranded itself as anti-fascist, anti-communist, and anti-monarchist. How did Lenin understand the relationship between the role of the working class and the role of leadership? Lenin wrote, in a passage cited by Miliband, "As a rule, and in most cases, classes are led by political parties. Political parties, as a general rule, are run by more or less stable groups, composed of the most authoritative, influential, and experienced members, who are elected to the most responsible positions and are called leaders. The working class needs a revolutionary party, according to Lenin. Otherwise, it might never pursue revolutionary politics. Left to its own devices, Lenin thought the working class is able to develop only trade union consciousness. Now, it has to be acknowledged that the working class in Lenin's day and the working class in Marx's day had virtually zero access to education. Working class children worked. School was an afterthought, if it was a thought at all. Before 1917, less than half of the Russian population could read. And in England, where working children were required to receive at least some formal schooling, school might be held in the same factory where the kids worked. Imagine how focused on their studies they must have been. Now, lack of a formal education doesn't necessarily make you a rube, any more than having an education guarantees you won't get fooled. But the state of the working class that Lenin confronted might put Lenin's statement about the need for leadership in a different light than it may seem to those of us who grew up in a highly industrialized country with free and universal public education. Free and universal public education, that was, after all, one of the demands in the Communist Manifesto. A perhaps more troubling criticism of Lenin's position is that vanguardism leads to substitutism. What's substitutism? What it sounds like. Trotsky says, the party organization at first substitutes itself for the party as a whole. Then, the Central Committee substitutes itself for the organization. And finally, a single dictator substitutes himself for the Central Committee. Lenin would have denied the accusation that what he wanted was blind obedience to an elite clique at the center of the party. But the charge was made, repeatedly, and by many. Miliband weighs in with his own thoughts about organization versus spontaneity as follows. Political parties of the working class are not debating societies, and they do need some degree of unity in what is a permanent and often bitter class struggle. A genuinely representative party in which all the divisions of the working class find full expression by way of factions and tendencies and endless debate may thereby find itself unable to cope with the very responsibilities which are the reason for its existence. Some degree of substitutism is bound to form part of any kind of representative organization and of representative politics at all levels. The notion of the party achieving an organic and perfectly harmonious representation of the class is nothing but a myth. Marx mostly avoided the problem by focusing on the class rather than the party, but the problem is there all the same. Revolutions are made by minorities, and have usually been the work of relatively small minorities. At the very least, some element of substitutism is here inevitable, and the refusal to engage in it may be fatal. May be fatal. Miliband has a specific example in mind. Rosa Luxemburg, speaking for the Spartacus League in 1918, said that the socialist organization would never take power by any other means than through the clear, unambiguous will of the vast majority of the proletarian masses from all of Germany. Miliband points out, 1 month after she drafted the program, she was dead, and the old order was safe. Miliband says, the demands of representatives on the one hand and of effectiveness on the other are not altogether irreconcilable, but it is an illusion to think that the contradiction is not a genuine one. And although it may be capable of attenuation, it is very unlikely to be fully resolved in any foreseeable future. In a situation where there's more than one party, the problem of substitutism doesn't go away. Miliband says, it is likely that the more than one party situation enhances the politics of leadership, insofar as it requires complex negotiations between allies or potential allies. Let's now turn to the question of workers' councils. How do workers' councils relate to class and to party? Workers' councils, also known as Soviets, are a recurring and spontaneous manifestation of popular power. So spontaneous, in fact, that Marx never saw them coming. The most important events in revolutionary history that took place during Marx's lifetime were the many national revolutions of 1848 and something called the Paris Commune, which we'll return to. And neither of those events led to workers' councils taking power. The Russian Revolution of 1905, the first of two Russian revolutions, so not the one led by the Bolsheviks, saw workers' councils taking power locally and coming into their own. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party then had a question to answer: the Soviets or the party? Lenin wrote in an unpublished letter to a newspaper in 1905 that the decision must certainly be both. Returning now to the Paris Commune. Suffice it to say, in 1871, Paris was cut off from the rest of France, being under siege by the Germans. What happened next was really existing socialism, citywide, the Paris Commune. The Commune, Marx writes, was formed of the municipal councillors chosen by universal suffrage, responsible and recallable at short terms. The Commune was to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. The police was at once stripped of its political attributes and turned into the responsible and at all times recallable agent of the Commune. So were the officials of all other branches of the administration. The public service had to be done at workmen's wages. Picking up with Miliband, it was this which, for Lenin, constituted a whole program, precisely the gigantic replacement of certain institutions by institutions of a fundamentally different type. These other institutions being the Soviets, which provided a bond with the people, with the majority of the people, so intimate, so indissoluble, so easily verifiable and renewable, that nothing remotely like it existed in the previous state apparatus. Now, Miliband is, in my personal opinion, a little too quick to say that the Soviets model didn't work. During the Bolshevik Revolution and subsequent / concurrent Russian Civil War, the nation of Ukraine managed to maintain really existing stateless socialism, an anarchist quote-unquote republic. One of their slogans was, "All power to the Soviets, right now." It lasted for years, where the Paris Commune lasted only a few months, and at its largest it had a population of millions. There isn't time here to go into this very interesting episode in history. Mike Duncan has given a better summary of it than I ever could in a million years. So if this sort of thing interests you, check out the episode Anarchy in Ukraine of his acclaimed Revolutions podcast. We now come to the first of several hair-raising Bolshevik quotes we'll see in Miliband's book. From Lenin in 1919. "Yes, the dictatorship of one party. We stand upon it and cannot depart from this ground, since this is the party which in the course of decades has won for itself the position of vanguard of the whole factory and industrial proletariat." Whatever we may think of Lenin's statement, which we'll revisit in Chapter 6, there can be no argument that Power was increasingly centralized in the years following the 1917 revolution. By 1921, the party forbade all factions. But already by 1918, decisions had ceased to be made by majority vote. But already by 1917, the authority of the party's Central Committee replaced that of the Congress. The Russian Revolution is like that. To steal a line from Deleuze and Guattari, we don't know when it started going wrong. But we know it did go wrong. Any breach was punishable by expulsion from the party by 1921. The problem was well understood by some in power. Trotsky, in 1922, wrote that, although having inscribed on our banner all power to the Soviets, we were still formally supporting the slogans of democracy, unable as yet to give the masses, or even ourselves, a definite answer as to what would happen if the cogs of the wheels of formal democracy failed to mesh with the cogs of the Soviet system. But the problem kept getting worse. By the 12th Party Congress in 1923, Zinoviev was already proclaiming that we need a strong Central Committee which is leader of everything. And it was, of all people, Stalin who demurred, since Stalin did not want power concentrated somewhere other than the Secretariat and other working organs of the party. Zinoviev's story ends very, very badly. He was arrested and tried as a terrorist in 1936 at the beginning of the Great Purge. Which brings us to our next hair-raising quote. Courtesy of Trotsky, "Comrades, none of us wishes to be, or can be, right against the party. In the last instance, the party is always right, because it is the only historic instrument which the working class possesses for the solution of its fundamental tasks." We see here the idea that there can only be one single expression of the will of the working class, the Communist Party. This is the same Trotsky who had argued against substitutism just a few years ago. Setting aside the difficult question of evaluating Trotsky, we'll have our hands plenty full evaluating Lenin. We can unequivocally condemn the authoritarian version of socialism that came to be known as Stalinism. Miliband says, Stalinism was a regime which stamped out opposition in anticipation and constantly struck at people who were perfectly willing to conform on suspicion that they might eventually cease to be willing. No such conformity was demanded in the first years of the revolution, and it formed no part of Leninism. We'll end with a comment Miliband makes about Mao's understanding of the relationship between working people and the working class party. Mao says, "If there is no democracy, if ideas are not coming from the masses, it is impossible to establish a good line, good general and specific policies. Our leading organs merely play the role of a processing plant. Everyone knows that if a factory has no raw material, it can't do any processing. Without democracy, you have no understanding of what is happening down below. Top-level organs of leadership will depend on one-sided and incorrect material to decide issues. Then you will find it impossible to avoid being subjectivist and impossible to achieve true centralism." But Miliband points out a crucial problem for democratic centralists. He says, popular involvement is not the same thing as democratic participation and control, and it's perfectly possible to have a very large measure of the one without having much or even any of the other.